I think, talking about the responsibility of scientists, I think it's fair to say that scientists and engineers have been part of warfare since warfare started, really. I mean, if you think of sword making and fortifications, those were very much designed or enabled by the very early scientists, and making a sword is a pretty technological effort involving new materials and all the rest of it. I should also say, by the way, I'm actually speaking today from Imperial College. I'm visiting, I no longer work there, but I was visiting a colleague and using the internet here. And this evening, I'm going to a meeting in the House of Commons where there will be there's a meeting called No More Hiroshimas, and there's somebody speaking from the South African ambassador, and one of the people from Hiroshima is speaking as well. So that's what I'll be doing later this evening. As I mentioned before, I mean, one of the early scientists, Leonardo da Vinci, designed fortifications for the Medici, and a big arms company now in Italy is the Leonardo Arms Manufacturing Company. So there's a direct link there. Now, today, the most destructive weapons are certainly nuclear weapons, although biological and chemical weapons must come a close second and are classified as weapons of mass destruction. But at the moment, and as Hannah's referred to, huge numbers of people are being killed or maimed by non-nuclear weapons, artillery, airdrop bombs of huge power, and warheads on missiles of various types, so-called small arms, and drones as the most recent thing. And we're now seeing people wanting to use AI to target individuals. And I did actually write 2 articles which are on the SGR website about what's going on in Gaza and how a very large database of individuals has been collated, and that's how individuals are being targeted have been targeted in Gaza. And frankly, it was a very haphazard targeting process. So virtually anybody could be targeted. To pretend that they were somehow military operatives is quite ludicrous. And it's very clear from really the outset that a whole range of war crimes are being committed continually in Gaza, and literally hundreds of lawyers and eminent people, legal experts, have made that very clear. So, and all of these weapons rely on scientists and engineers. So you asked me to give a brief description of the Manhattan Project. I dare say you're pretty familiar with it. But essentially, the first atomic bomb was a 15-kiloton nuclear fission weapon made using highly enriched uranium. So it had to be enriched uranium-235 up to about 90%. So then you can have a sustained chain reaction in a few kilograms of the particular unstable isotope of uranium. And the first nuclear weapon that was dropped on Hiroshima was about 15 kilotons. That's 15,000 tons of TNT equivalent, which is small by today's standards. And the purpose of that project was to defeat the rise of, to defeat Hitler. But in reality, and also the other weapon that was dropped at Nagasaki, that was the other design, or 2 designs. One was the nuclear fission weapon with the highly enriched uranium, but the other one was using plutonium. And to make a bomb with plutonium, you have to compress plutonium, and the only way you can get plutonium is from inside a nuclear reactor as well. You can't just process uranium as found in the earth, and that is a much more complicated process. And a similar size detonation occurred over Nagasaki. So the bomb designers basically wanted to check both types of designs worked. They had done one test in the Alamogordo Desert, but they chose Nagasaki and Hiroshima as targets which hadn't been subjected to hardly any aerial bombardment, because they actually wanted to see the results of the explosions on these cities. And today, the weapons are much, much larger. So at the time, the weapons were fairly simple fission devices, either with enriched uranium or plutonium. But towards the end of the war, really, I think by the time that Hitler had been defeated, there was a discussion about what was called the super. Several of the scientists involved with the project later on really thought they shouldn't make an even more powerful weapon than they had already. But Taylor in particular argued that they must develop what he called the super, which was essentially using the fission bomb as the trigger to the fusion device. And that's what all modern weapons are like. So the initiation is a nuclear fission weapon, which then causes fusion in a container adjacent to the fission explosion. And then that fusion reaction in turn consumes a uranium casing. So modern weapons are fission, fusion, fission weapons. And there's really nothing to limit the size of the fusion element, because it's quite easy to just add more materials that can be fused by the intense radiation neutron bombardment from the fission device. And typically today, one nuclear warhead is 7 to 30 times larger at 100 to 500,000 tons of TNT equivalent. And currently, there are huge numbers of such weapons, with mainly by the United States and Russia, it should be said. But there are 9 countries that have nuclear weapons, and that includes Israel as well, although nobody really talks about it very much, but that is the position. I was lucky enough to work with one of the scientists on the Manhattan. I didn't work on the Manhattan Project, otherwise I'd be very old, but I did some work with Joseph Rockwell, who was one of the scientists in the Manhattan Project. And he said he left the project once Germany was defeated. He could see, right, we've done it. We don't need a nuclear weapon, so I'm going. And I later on worked with him on some of the first studies, the WHO studies on the impacts of global nuclear war. And not long after that, there was the Einstein-Russell Manifesto saying there really should be a limit on nuclear weapons. They shouldn't be further developed. But it was very clear in the Manhattan Project that the further development of nuclear weapons wasn't to do with defeating Japan. It was about combating Russia because America saw itself as the new superpower, and they wanted to make sure that Russia couldn't compete. So that was very clear. That was the objective. When people say that they had to drop the bomb to defeat Japan, that isn't true. We could argue about whether it hastened it or not, but Japan was essentially already defeated. It's what I think. And at the time when I was writing some books about the impacts of nuclear weapons on London, which was when I first got involved in this, I went to the British Library and I looked up some of the original sources, the original documents from the 1940s to find out what was planned, and it confirmed what I thought. So I think, so what is my view on what the responsibility of scientists and engineers? Well, in a very simplistic terms, you could say, well, why don't scientists have an ethic of doing no harm, for example? So in that case, it would really challenge whether you would work on any weapon system, come to that. Although there's always arguments that you can justify it because somebody else is threatening you and so on. You could indeed refuse to work on weapons of mass destruction. I think it's fair to say that I think most scientists don't particularly want to work on such projects, and they don't find them, they're not exactly interesting scientifically, let's put it that way. But I think it's the problem we face is much worse than that, because you could say, well, it's scientists' job to communicate, to warn people. Well, I think scientists have, but what I see at the moment is a real problem with having a fact or a factually based discussion about these issues right now. Some people say we're in a post-truth world, and you could say there might be some truth in that. I think I would say that us scientists and engineers haven't done enough. We haven't been loud enough. We haven't worked sufficiently with politicians, because the people who actually influence things are ultimately politicians and people with lots of money who influence them. So it's not enough simply just for some scientists to not work on these things. There's a much bigger responsibility now to communicate much more effectively and somehow get these points across, to be educators. It's not enough to be a good scientist. You have to be able to communicate very effectively. And some scientists are quite happy to work on weaponry and such like. So I've got a few slides which I'll go through, and then we could have a discussion about this, because I think at the moment we face a whole series of new threats which have been caused by the very poor implementation of technology in many respects. So I'll just go through these slides quickly. You can find a lot of this information on the SGR website, which is in this first slide, the sgr.org.uk. I'd encourage you to look at that site. And I did also write some articles about the situation in Gaza and how databases and targeting is being used in that bombardment. Right, no, that didn't happen. What's going on? Oh, there we go. So you're probably aware of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. They produce their little clock talking about how dangerous the world is. Now, they've said that for every year for the last few years, it's been the most dangerous in humanity's history. And actually, the clock is currently at 89 seconds to midnight for a whole series of reasons. And they are a heightened risk of nuclear war, particularly with the new militarism in Europe, the war in Ukraine, and possibly what's going on in the Middle East is another risk of nuclear weapons being used. It was avoided, which is a good sign, between India and Pakistan recently. A growing climate emergency. There are these things called planetary survival boundaries, which I will show you in the next slide. And we're breaching at least 6 of those already. And this is from the bulletin, a political systems rhythm that's full of dangerous and deliberate misinformation. And we are seeing a lot of that in the US administration currently, or in the current way the US is working, that things are being done for reasons which you can't say are anything to do with facts. They're to do with people's opinions and with a very biased way of looking at things. So these are the planetary boundaries which have been looked at. And where it's green, we're okay. And where it's not green, we're not. So we're okay at the moment with ozone, with aerosols, and we're just about okay at the moment with ocean acidification. But we're not okay with these biochemical flows here. That's phosphorus and nitrogen, for example. What we're doing to land systems, the biosphere, the levels of CO2, a whole range of new chemical entities with no idea what they're going to do, such as microplastics. So there's a whole series of risks currently, which on the whole are, I think almost entirely, are not getting any better. But then I thought, okay, where do nuclear weapons fit into this? Well, if there's a nuclear war, all of those things, all of these boundaries would be exceeded and you could say, well, why isn't the threat of nuclear war already included in those planetary boundaries? It was because it hasn't happened. But a nuclear conflict could cause global impacts, or if it would cause global impacts. Also, just the levels of military activity itself is creating another huge amount of carbon to be emitted into the atmosphere. And if the military was a country, it would be the 4th biggest emitter, just after China, United States, and India. So, and those are figures which SGR has calculated and have been widely reported by the military themselves. So this is talking about this idea of nuclear deterrence keeping us safe being a delusion. I won't go through all of that. You could read that later, but there have been numerous close misses, equipment failure, false alarms, military exercises that almost went wrong. And it's almost taken, it's become a propaganda term, I think. Nuclear deterrence keeps us safe, which I just don't think you can argue that realistically, but we're continually told that, and that's why in the UK we have nuclear weapons, and why there are all the tactical so-called tactical nuclear weapons kept in Europe, although you can't really think of any way they could be used without causing an incredible nuclear conflict and making the situation even worse. So nuclear weapons are designed to be very destructive. It's not a byproduct. They're literally designed, their delivery systems are designed to cause damage and to kill people, essentially. And they're deliberately targeted in part against cities as well, which is fairly standard. So one weapon can kill 81,000, injure 200,000. And those sorts of deaths are equivalent to 6 months of the Ukraine war, and comparable to what's happened in Gaza. But in Gaza, that's been going on now getting on for 2 years. But that could be done in a few minutes. If there was a regional nuclear war with 100 Hiroshima-type weapons, the studies that have been done recently talk about a 10-year nuclear winter, at least 2 billion people at risk of starvation because of the huge amounts of carbon lofted high into the atmosphere. And a global nuclear war would be even worse, with radioactive fallout over large areas, and nuclear reactors being targeted would cause even more long-standing nuclear isotopes spread around. So you're talking about nuclear winter, ozone destruction, terrible impacts on the seas because of the phytoplankton being destroyed with the ozone being destroyed. So you're talking about a huge extinction event, and what we call civilization has to be at risk, it would be said. That's a little schematic about how it happens, because it isn't just fires, it's fires and smoke which gets above the weather and it stays up there, basically. Just looking at UK nuclear weapons, a UK submarine carries at least 40 of these Trident warheads. The only thing about it that's made in the UK is the warhead. We lease the missiles from America and they maintain them. They also, all the targeting is reliant on America. So it's really an American system. The launch tubes are American. And I could go on. So the idea that these things could ever be independently used, it's got to be questioned. So what we did was work out, well, we know that 100 Hiroshima weapons used in a India-Pakistan conflict could cause a global nuclear winter. What could Trident use if it was hitting several cities as well as military targets? Well, 25 warheads would create a fire zone equivalent to those 100 Hiroshimas. So I just got a schematic here of a Hiroshima bomb over York, which I did for another presentation. And there's the Hiroshima fire zone, and comparing it to a UK Trident warhead. I should say the American Trident warheads are larger, about 3 times larger. And then if you want to compare, so here we've got this nuclear winter threshold, that's what this square is. Now, you'll see there's 10 little circles across. So 10 by 10, that's 100 Hiroshima-type weapons could do that. Or, if you put in the Trident, the UK Trident D5, you've got 5 across, so it's 5 by 5, 25. So the threshold for a global nuclear winter is 25 of the smaller UK Trident warheads. In other words, a tiny fraction of the nuclear arsenals, which stand at tens of thousands, could cause this global famine, drought, shift of the weather systems, which is the nuclear winter. And the studies that have been done are much more robust than when this was first talked about by people like Carl Sagan back in 1983. The new models are very robust indeed. And here's some graphs. So the top line, the regional conflicts, middle line, launch or warning conflict, major nuclear conflicts. And you can see the levels of cooling and over a period of 10 years. And then I've drawn in blue what one salvo from one Trident submarine could do, which is incredible, really, the devastation. And yes, it's just worth saying that the power of a Trident submarine is several times, about 4 to 6 times that of all the weapons used in World War II, including the 2 nuclear weapons. And if it's just the launch and warning weapons, that's about 2,000 or 1,000 of the warheads by Russia and America. That's 260 times the firepower of all the weaponry used in all the years of World War II. And I think this is the heart of the problem. So we've got huge nuclear spending on nuclear weapons. This slide is out of date. The figure's more than $83 billion. And then, so the companies get 15 billion, and they can then hire lobbyists who then put in millions to lobbyists and think tanks who then in turn lobby the nuclear weapons manufacturers or the politicians to have more nuclear weapons. In the States, there's a bipartisan group which makes sure that almost every state has senators from both Republicans and Democrats who support nuclear weapons. And they see them as bringing jobs to some of these rural areas, for example. And I think you could see the same if you put fossil fuel in here. There's a huge amount spent by the fossil fuel companies lobbying, and they spend a lot of money influencing, creating think tanks which deliberately push misinformation, or a bit like the tobacco industry did this. And it's the same process. So it creates a vicious cycle of producing, doing the wrong things and not doing what needs to be done. This graphic came out of the global campaign against nuclear weapons. And there is a treaty called the Treaty of Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was negotiated at the United Nations. And it's there for any country to sign up for. It's supported by most countries. And the odd ones out are the nuclear powers. And the nuclear powers, so you had the site of France, Britain, Russia, and America, all collaborating to make sure or to try and block this treaty, which says something about the power of the weapon lobby. And that's what we're facing. So that's the end of my slides. So thank you for that. And I'm very happy to have a discussion about these things.